Welcome to today's Global Connections television program. I'm Bill Miller. The main purpose of this show is to promote a discussion of major international issues such as war and peace, economic and social development, climate change, and human rights that impact people worldwide. New knowledge will inspire, involve, and motivate all of us to better deal with these challenges and to help create a better world. Today's program is going to focus upon natural disasters and human-made disasters and what we can do to anticipate them and also what we can do to recover from them. We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. Today we're going to be talking about what we can do to anticipate and also recover from a natural disaster or perhaps a human-made disaster. My guest today is an expert in this area. My guest today is Ms. Sarah Cliffe. Sarah Cliffe is the director at the Center on International Cooperation at New York University in New York, USA. Previously, Sarah Cliffe was the special representative of the World Bank's World Development Report on Conflict, Security, and Development. Sarah Cliffe, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
It's great to be with you.
I appreciate you being with me today. Let's talk a little bit about the center first. We'll get into some of these issues, very important issues, but the center is very important too. You mentioned before the show you're celebrating your 20th anniversary at the center. What exactly does it do? Well, it was formed 20 years ago, and why was it formed?
So the Center was formed 20 years ago really to address issues that are just at the nexus of politics, security, human rights, and development. So we don't specialize only in the politics or security area or only in the development area. We cover issues where those cross over. And we're not an academic research institute. We do policy applied research primarily with the UN and with other international organizations.
Mm-hmm. And you said it was development and security,
That's
two
right.
very important building blocks, if you will, of a stable society. Let's just start off with security. What are some of the projects you're working on, or perhaps some of the activities that are underway, and who are your partners in that particular area?
So we work in 5 primary areas. We look at humanitarian crises, and there we're working with a group of 5 of the most important UN operational agencies and the World Bank to see how can they improve and strengthen approaches to today's humanitarian crises. We see, of course, now an unprecedented number of people worldwide who've been displaced primarily by conflicts around the world. We also work very closely with the areas of the UN that deal with peacekeeping operations and with sending mediation and political support to countries going through crises. And there we publish an annual review of all the UN's peace operations, which looks at how those have addressed particular challenges and issues which are top of the priority for them that year. We also work on violent extremism, another area where you have a crossover between development, human rights, and security issues that's very important. We work on the implementation of some of the global goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, particularly the new goal on access to peace and justice, again an area that crosses development and security. And last, we look at the overall future direction for the UN, particularly in this year as we're going to see an appointment of a new Secretary General. So to look at some of the challenges that will face him or her as they come into office.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Now you mentioned peacekeeping, and that of course peacekeeping was not mentioned in the charter, the United Nations Charter in 1945, but by 1948 the first peacekeeping mission was set up, and today there are 16 peacekeeping missions, as I recall, with about 124,000 troops, police combined in that. What exactly are you focusing on in the peacekeeping area? What types of activities are you undertaking? Are you evaluating peacekeeping missions to determine the effectiveness of the mission, or what exactly are you doing in that area?
So every year we work with the UN Department for Peacekeeping and for Political Affairs. First of all, just to bring together all the information on peacekeeping. So we have on our website a source of information that researchers or people who are interested in peacekeeping can go to. And that's done in close partnership with the UN departments concerned. Then each year we'll take one special issue. Last year we looked at the role of special envoys, which of course we've seen as very important in conflicts like Syria or Yemen and so forth. Next year we'll look at the challenge of conflict prevention.
Very good. That's extremely important. Very, very important. We were talking about peacekeeping and talking about, you mentioned the situation, the Syrian situation, and that is something that has really just was totally unexpected, I guess. Perhaps it wasn't, I don't know. But as we look back, not too many years ago, just 2 or 3 years ago, this has really developed into quite a crisis. And of course, not only internally, the people have been killed, so many areas leveled to piles of rubble, dead people. It's just a tragedy. It's been unfolding. What can we do? What can be done? Is there something that can be done that we could provide some suggestions to help alleviate that problem? I know there are many people working on this right now, the UN agencies, Secretary General, the non-governmental organizations, but are there things that we could do to try to at least ameliorate some of those problems?
The first imperative in all situations like Syria, of course, is to save lives. And there the UN really plays the central role in the humanitarian assistance it provides. So including providing help to people who are in the areas of Syria still most affected by active fighting, but also to the many, many Syrian refugees. So we now have more displaced people and refugees worldwide than at any time since the end of World War II. And a lot of that is because of the crisis in Syria and the number of people who have been forced from their homes. But of course, the reason why so many people are displaced and we have so many refugees is the conflict. So in the end, the key role there for the UN is on peace and security and on the efforts to solve the conflict and to work with all those member states who have influence to try to persuade the parties on the ground that really the time has come, that this is the absolute imperative now to make a success of the ceasefire and to be able to move forward there.
And the issues we're talking about today, many of them can be found, probably all of them can be found on your website at cic.nyu.edu.
That's
and
right.
Our viewers can go to that to get much more information about what we're talking about. The Syrian situation obviously has created as we were talking about, a devastation from many, many sides and many different angles. And of course, we've also seen, we talk about security, we've seen a huge out-migration from Northern Africa into Europe. Are you focusing very much on that as far as trying to lend a hand or give some ideas on what can be done to help people who are fleeing from persecution or whatever the case might be? And of course, the recipient countries obviously need some help too to some degree. So is that an issue area?
So that's very much part of our work at the moment. I think everyone now has recognized that a lot of these crises are not short term. You know, we're used to thinking of humanitarian emergencies as being like an earthquake or a natural disaster, where it was a challenge maybe for 6 months or 12 months, but then with international help and with the country working to solve things, people could go back to their homes. The reality that we face now is that people who are displaced from their homes by conflict are displaced for 17 years on average. So this is a much longer term, more protracted kind of crisis. So there you have the leading agencies in the UN who are dealing with those problems have been looking at what better type of approach can you have to deal with the fact that a child who is now made a refugee may actually grow up in that status before they're able to go home. And how do you make sure that that child is not left behind in development efforts and gets the same opportunities to be educated, to have opportunities to have a livelihood as someone who had not been displaced from their home by conflict.
Now we've been talking about security issues and in disaster areas, but there are also other types. You mentioned earthquakes. We saw not too long ago a devastating earthquake in Chile, not too many years ago, a terrible one in Nepal. We've seen typhoons go through the Philippines. We've seen just a tremendous number of natural disasters, and some of these have been linked, like the typhoons, the cyclones, have been linked to climate change. And of course, there's a strong correlation there between the two. But what are you doing in that particular area to try to anticipate and to recover from these disasters, really?
Yeah, no, and indeed, just as you said, Bill, there is a worry now that the increasing number of natural disasters that we're seeing are linked to climate change. In some estimates of the natural disasters last year, over 50% of them can be traced back to effects linked to climate change. So I think that we have to first hope that the climate change agreements and the implementation of the Paris Agreement that was reached last year on climate change really try to put in place the mitigating measures, the measures to stop that impact getting worse. But when natural disasters do happen, we also have been working to look at how approaches can be strengthened, particularly to help the local actors on the ground, the governments and the NGOs who are struggling on the ground to provide assistance. I would say, though, this is an area in general where the communities dealing with natural disasters have been quite good at anticipating and preparing in advance so that the societies have a response. We're typically less good at that in conflict situations, maybe because those situations are made by humans, not by acts of nature. We're less good at anticipating. And one of the discussions going on at the UN this year is how do we get better at anticipating and preventing those conflicts before they escalate.
And you referenced earlier the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Development Agenda, which tie right together. What exactly are the Sustainable Development Goals? Not all 17 of them, but just in general, why were they adopted by the UN General Assembly in September of this past year, I guess it was? And what are the nations of the world trying to do to really create a better world with them?
So the Sustainable Development Goals are indeed 17 goals that were adopted by all countries around the world last year. They cover areas like health, like employment, making sure that people have decent jobs, like education, making sure that no child gets left behind, and even access to justice and peaceful societies. And there are three things that we can say are really different about these goals. One is that they apply in every country around the world. So when countries adopted them, they said, yeah, some countries are further behind others, but issues like crime and violence, like education, like inequality and poverty, actually apply in every country. Even the United States populations are worried about that. Second is that they're wider in scope. They really cover the issues that people on the street are concerned about, whether it's inequality in incomes or whether it's are they secure in their own homes, do they have access to justice? And third, they have a particular objective that was put in the goals that is new, which is about reaching those who are left furthest behind. And I think this is one of the reasons that we see sometimes increasing conflict or social unrest, is because people see a world in which not everyone is getting the same opportunities. So the goals are a way of addressing that problem too.
And one of the main themes you just mentioned, nobody is left behind. No one is left behind. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon has emphasized that. The UN agencies have emphasized that. The Population and Development Commission, many other entities throughout the UN system have focused on that. You mentioned also income inequality. This is an issue that is getting much more visibility, getting more highly visible than it was. Years ago, when we talk about income inequality, everybody said, well, just look at Latin America. They don't say that anymore because Latin America is actually improving, and areas like the United States is getting they're getting worse than what they were. How important is that, and what can be done to overcome this huge chasm? It's a Grand Canyon of, in some respects, between the haves and the have-nots to a large degree. But how important is it, and what can we do?
Yeah, so this is one of the really key challenges, and it's one of the areas that is completely new in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think you're absolutely right that what we saw in the last 20 years was actually incredibly fast average progress. So when we look worldwide at how many people escaped poverty or how average incomes increased, the progress was actually really fast over that 20-year period. But the problem is not everyone participated in that progress. So what we see now in many societies, and not only in the poorest societies, also in the developed world, is a lot of dissatisfaction that growth is not being shared equally by all members of the population. So addressing this is going to be one of the key issues. It needs, of course, to have measures that help those who are poorest, but that also institute measures where people accept that actually a somewhat more equal society, which gives more equal opportunities, may be in the interest of social cohesion.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately financed, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections Television are solely those of the moderator and his guests. Our viewers are invited to check out the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous shows. If you're interested in distributing our shows through PBS, community access television, educational institutions, a website, or any other media outlet, please go to our website for more information. Global Connections Television is provided as a public service at no cost. Today we're taking a look at a wide range of issues, all the way from trying to anticipate and to plan for not only a natural disaster or a human-made disaster, but also what to do in recovering from that particular disaster. And we're tying in security and development into this whole discussion. My guest today is an expert on these issues. My guest today is Ms. Sarah Cliffe. Ms. Sarah Cliffe is the director at the Center on International Cooperation at New York University. Sarah, we're talking about income inequality. We could probably spend the whole show on that. It's so important. But a lot of folks who look at this situation, economists and historians and people like that, say one of the main reasons in the United States, and I don't know if this may tie into what you're doing or not, but one reason is that there's been a decline in union membership in this country. The union movement back in the 20s, 30s, 40s, really in the 50s, really built the middle class through the coal industry, the automobile industry, whatever it might be. But in the private sector, you see a decline of unions. In fact, there's union busting going on in the United States. It's just out and out union busting. And a lot of people are saying that, well, if you don't have some type of collective bargaining or have some type of voice in setting your economic future in your professional position, that we're going to lose that middle class. And we see a decline in the middle class in the United States. Do you bring that in? I know you're probably not an economist, or maybe you are, but do you factor those items into your discussion?
So not only do I have an economic background, but
I
also used to be a trade union organizer. So you asked me a question that's
I'll check
dear
your
to my
biography.
heart. So indeed, unions have clearly played a role in protecting the gains of growth for the middle class and the working class in many countries. And we still see that many countries where income is a little bit more equal are those which have a strong kind of voice and collective bargaining mechanism. One of the issues that is interesting for the work that I specialize in, which tends more to be countries that have been affected by conflict or that have gone through periods of transition, is that trade unions have also played a very strong role in that type of political transition. So in countries, for instance, like South Africa during the transition from apartheid, Chile and Argentina after the dictatorships, even more recently in Tunisia, we saw trade unions play a very key role in the national dialogue which helped stabilize Tunisia. And this is one of the things that we don't always talk about. So the role of trade unions is not popular with everyone, but there really is some quite good evidence that during periods of recovering from conflict or political transition, trade unions can play a key role.
Now you've focused on several of the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17, not all 17 Sustainable Development Goals. How important is it for not only the 193 countries at the United Nations, the member states of the UN, basically almost every country in the world is a member of the United Nations, but how important is it not only for those countries and their leaders to commit themselves through political will and through financial and technical resources, but also to bring in other players, other non-governmental organizations, UN agencies, the private sector. They have a tremendous role to play in this, and they have tremendous benefits from these types of goals. How important is that?
That's also a crucial difference, actually, with these new Sustainable Development Goals. The old Millennium Development Goals tended to be seen as much more the responsibility of governments and international organizations. With these new Sustainable Development Goals, what we have is a very deliberate partnership, which is saying that governments can't achieve this on their own. The United Nations can't achieve it on its own. What you need is to bring in the community organizations, civil society, the private sector, trade unions, as we discussed, faith-based organizations, and really get a combined collaborative effort going forward. There's actually an action agenda that was developed in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, so it's called the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which really lays out why you need to bring the efforts of all those constituencies together if we're going to make progress on these goals.
And of course, the United Nations, they were critical in bringing the players together, and it'll be critical to keep them together for the next 15 years. Now, one of the main players at the United Nations is the Secretary General. There have been 8 Secretaries General of the UN. There's now a selection process underway to select the 9th Secretary General. Does your organization focus on that, or how do you look at this whole selection of the Secretary General? Because the Secretary General is a key player in the world. Some people say, well, he doesn't, or she doesn't, whatever the case might be, doesn't have quite as much power, but you still have tremendous power when you're working with 193 countries that are basically the political leaders of the world. And also the private sector comes up here, but to New York. But have you looked at this situation with the selection process, and how do you analyze it?
So this is really a new process this year. In the past, the Secretary General of the United Nations used to be selected through a pretty closed-door process. So there were no declared candidates, there were no interviews, there was very little public debate or engagement in what, as you've said, is perhaps the primary global job in the end. So this year the process is very different. There is a process whereby the candidates have to be publicly declared. There are hearings in the General Assembly of the United Nations where you can go online now and see in YouTube all the candidates going through a whole set of questions and what their responses are. So I think that's a very welcome bit of transparency into what really is a very important appointment process. My organisation doesn't work directly on the process or the selection of candidates, but what we are looking at is the substantive agenda that those candidates will face. So whoever is appointed, there's great pressure this time round to see if we could have the first woman Secretary General of the United Nations, but whoever is appointed, there will be a set of challenges that they will need to take on. So looking at identifying those and seeing where there's really momentum and support for action is more the work that we do.
And when Secretary General Ban Ki-moon concludes his second 5-year term, December 31st of this year, what do you think will be the major challenges? There's a couple of major challenges that new Secretary General will deal with.
So I think there's a short-term and then some longer-term challenges. The short-term challenge you have to think will probably be in the area of conflict prevention. So when the average person around the world thinks about the UN, I think they often think about the conflicts and crises we see around the world, and they see the credibility not only of the UN as an organisation, but of all the governments who work together at the UN. That credibility is really bound up in, can the UN help to manage conflicts in areas like the Middle East? So I think it will be almost unavoidable that the next Secretary General will have to focus on that area. That's linked, though, to 2 longer-term challenges. One is the whole issue of the structure of development and the global economy, which we've talked about. So unless there's a general movement towards making sure that economic progress delivers benefits not just for a few, but really makes everyone feel they have a stake, we will, I think, see more instability in future. And the other is the aspect of climate change. That we have a new agreement last year, but we still have to see the actual follow-through on that agreement. And unless there is really sustained action, there is a great danger that we could see more natural disasters and more issues of this type happening. And I think we can say that those are issues which are the classic ones for the UN to address, because the UN was really established after World War II to help deal with issues that no one country alone, whether that be the US or China or South Africa, could address. And those are some of the issues that indeed will need collective action to make progress on.
And of course, it's a strength and perhaps a little bit of a challenge too to bring all 193 countries of the world together under one roof, but it is a collective operation. No one group or one country is going to defeat climate change. No one country is going to overcome income inequality, but they have to work together. And really, when you look at the UN, correct me if I'm wrong, but the UN General Assembly actually agrees on more than it disagrees on. That may not be the perception out in the general public, but that is, I think, the fact of the matter. But before we run out of time, let me just ask you, you're a UN observer, you've worked for the UN Development Program, you've worked for the World Bank, which is part of the UN family, UN system. How do you perceive the UN as far as what can be done to improve? We hear a lot about internal reform, reforming the United Nations. What can be done to make the UN more efficient and more effective? As someone who is a UN observer, the things that can be done for this Secretary General or the next Secretary General or the whole body to deal with?
So the UN, of course, can only do what its governments agree to do. So when we look at areas like conflict prevention, really the primary challenge there is for the governments of countries to be able to negotiate and debate and to find a way out of situations that have been an impasse, like the situation in Syria. But then the UN does also face some challenges as an organization. So it's an organization that was developed over time, was set up, of course, after World War II, but then different parts of it were added at different periods in the intervening decades. And now, of course, it's quite a complicated organization. So getting all those parts to work together can also really be a challenge.
Exactly. Well, Sarah Cliffe, this has been a fascinating discussion, and these issues are so vitally important. We encourage everyone to go to your website, cic.nyu.edu. And I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. Please join us again for the next episode of Global Connections Television. I'm Bill Miller. Thanks for watching.